The Gallic War is perhaps one of the most well-documented wars of antiquity that survives to this day. Thanks to the thorough writings of Julius Caesar and contributions by Aulus Hirtius, we have a complete picture of not only what the Romans were doing in Gaul, but a step-by-step guide on why certain actions were taken and how the Gallic War went from a single campaign to stop invading migrants to a full-blown war that spanned the entirety of modern-day France. It's no secret that today, most historians, and indeed most YouTubers who make content on the late Roman Republic, are very much anti-Caesarian. They cast Caesar as the warmonger tyrant, a man who was hell-bent on climbing his way to the top, even if his ladder was to be a mountain of corpses. The most cynical of these will often set their brains into airplane mode and make outlandish claims about Celtic genocide, or Caesar's so-called Gallic crusade, and make it out to be something that he'd planned from the very beginning. But the road from the two defensive campaigns of 58 to the ultimate betrayal of peace and crumbling of Romano-Gallic relations in 52 is a long and winding path that no one, not even Caesar, could have anticipated. In this video, I will be your guide along these treacherous roads, and by the end, it is my hope that we will arrive together safely on the other side, with a greater appreciation not only for Caesar, but of the complexities of history, and of the inevitable crumbling of relations between civilized men and those who still cling to their barbarian ways. And before we get started, if you like these kinds of videos, please make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment below with your thoughts, as it greatly helps the algorithm and supports me doing what I love the most. Officially, the campaigns in Gaul began in 58 BC, with the mass migration of a tribe called the Helvetii and their allies. But before we dive into Caesar's response, let's first take a look at Gaul itself, why the Helvetii were keen to leave their ancestral homes, and who was in fact responsible for instigating such an enormous undertaking. Gallia est omnis divisa in partes tres. The whole of Gaul is divided into three parts. These are the very first words that Caesar writes in his commentaries. It's very revealing that Caesar chooses to start here, and not simply with his response to the migration. From the first 5 pages, we not only learn that there are 3 distinct groups in Gaul, those being the Aquitani in the southwest, the Belgae in the northeast, and the Celts, or Gauls as they are called, making up the center. These 3 groups, however, are further broken down into various tribes and constituent tribes. The Gauls might make war on the Belgae, but frequently the Gauls will make war upon other Gauls, as is in the case between the Arverni, the tribe from which Vercingetorix hails, and the Aedui, one of Rome's most stalwart allies. The Belgae, Aquitani, and Celts each differ among themselves in their language, way of life, and laws, and those tribes who live along the Rhine, which separates Gaul from Germany, are especially warlike, as they are in constant contention with their German neighbors. While the bulk of the Rhine tribes belonged to the Belgae, a few of them were Celtic, and one of these was the Helvetii. Geographically, the Helvetii occupied lands which were largely hemmed in by natural barriers. To the east was the broad and deep Rhine River. To the north was the Jura mountain range. And finally, in the west, was Lake Lemanus and the Rhone River, which marked the border between the Helvetii and the Republic. Caesar mentions that these barriers greatly restricted their freedom of movement, and consequently their ability to wage war on their neighbors. A full 3 years before Caesar ever set foot in Gaul, a conspiracy was hatched between a Helvetii aristocrat named Orgetorix and influential members of other tribes, to uproot their entire tribe and go west. The plot which Orgetorix had formed with other nations would be exposed before the migration, and as a consequence, Orgetorix would be killed. But the Helvetii themselves still stuck to their plan of leaving their homes. So, in early 58 BC, they set out on their fateful journey. But Val, I hear you say, we already know this. In fact, the migration wouldn't have done any harm to the Romans, and it was clear Caesar was only using this as a casus belli to get his long-awaited conquest off the ground. Oh, my sweet summer child, if I had $1 for every Gaul that betrayed their word to the Romans, I'd have enough wealth to put Elon Musk to shame. And then I would challenge you to think of a single mass migration in the ancient world that didn't damage or destroy the lands and nations they passed through on their journey. Add to this the fact that the Helvetii and their constituents began pillaging the lands of the smaller tribes on their way west, and it quickly becomes clear that peace was never an option. But this is not a video about the Helvetii. What matters here is Caesar and his response to the enemy. If Caesar had a strong desire to conquer the entirety of Gaul, you'd expect him to make significant headway into Gallic lands during this initial campaign. In fact, however, we see the opposite. After the defeat of the Helvetii, not only did Caesar allow the errant tribe to retain all the territory they had abandoned, but he negotiated with the surrounding tribes to provide food and materials to the Helvetii so that they could rebuild and repopulate. Not only this, but we know of at least one other tribe, the Boii, who had been fellows of the Helvetii during their quest, that Caesar fully allowed to migrate. In fact, the Boii would join with the Aedui, Rome's ally, and be granted lands and eventually full and equal rights among the Aedui people. Keep in mind that at this time, it was fully within Caesar's power and authority to enslave the entirety of the tribes who surrendered, and send everything they had as booty back to Rome. A move which, coupled with Rome's seizure of new territories along the Rhine, would have vastly increased Caesar's own renown. But maybe this isn't enough for you. The war against the Helvetii was a single campaign that didn't even last a full year. What about his actions after that? Well, let's talk about it. Shortly after Caesar's victory over the Helvetii, a large number of representatives from Gallic states approached him and asked to be given a secret audience. At this meeting, the Gauls revealed to Caesar that much of the strife in Gaul had, in fact, been caused by the Germans and their king, Ariovistus. These Germans, who had been invited over the Rhine as mercenaries to fight for a tribe called the Sequani against the Aedui, had in fact conquered and subjugated the very Gauls who hired them. The Sequani, who had been forced to surrender a third of their land to Ariovistus, were now being asked for another third. Meanwhile, the German king was demanding from the surrounding Gauls hostages, which he took and tortured cruelly to instill fear in the tribes. The Romans of this time understood very well the threat of the Germanic menace. As the generation before Caesar had fought against the rampaging Teutonus and Cimbri during their Great Migration. Once again, I'm not going to go into great detail regarding the campaign here, but we can glean a lot from the actions of both the Gauls and their Roman saviors. First, it's interesting to note that these tribes were able to set aside their differences, recognizing not only Ariovistus for the threat he represented, but Caesar for the stability he could bring as a power broker in the region. Even the Treveri, a tribe of the Belgae who will become relevant later, sent envoys to Caesar complaining of the damages that Ariovistus had caused and the danger he presented to all. I've often wondered why, given that these tribes came together under Caesar, they were not able to come together sooner and organize their own united front against the Germans. Alas, such is the plight of the barbarian, and their need to appeal to their betters is perhaps the simplest and best explanation that we have. Let's get back on track. I honestly think, after reading and rereading the texts several times, that the aftermath of Caesar's victory against Ariovistus is really when the cracks began to show. Caesar's policy seems to have revolved around two main principles. First, to establish and keep two stable borders. those between the Romans and the Gauls, and those between the Gauls and the Germans. And second, to bestow rewards to Rome's allies by returning to them lands and hostages they had previously lost. We saw an example of the first policy already with the Helvetii, but it occurs again here, as Caesar seized no territory along the Rhine, nor did he punish any of the river tribes for their part in bringing the Germans over in the first place. Well, at least not directly. I mentioned earlier that the Germans were invited over by the Sequani, originally to aid them and their Arverni allies against the Aedui. Well, the result of their war was that the Sequani seized a large portion of Aedui land for themselves, and this greatly increased their power and prestige in the region, or would have, if Ariovistus hadn't basically enslaved the lesser demons to his will. When the war with the Germans was concluded, Caesar endeavored to restore the nations back to their pre-war borders. What this meant is that the Aedui got all their territory back, and the Sequani ended up losing everything they had fought so hard to gain. Not only this, but in what I believe was a move meant to protect against a German counteroffensive, as Ariovistus had escaped back to Germany during the fighting, Caesar left his legions under the command of Labienus in Sequani territory for the winter. And this, perhaps, is where the first domino begins to fall. For in the north, the Belgae saw this army and began to talk amongst themselves. Some stoked the fires of war, claiming Caesar was only positioning this army here in order to invade the following spring. Others said that regardless of Caesar's intentions, it was not right that either Germans or Romans be involved in Gaul whatsoever. Others still perhaps knew that defeating the Romans would deprive the south of its primary protectorate, giving the Belgae a chance to expand and make war. Whatever the reason, or combination of reasons, the Belgae decided that now was the time to strike, and amongst themselves they began to assemble a host of men that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Spies brought back reports of this gathering darkness to Labienus, who sent messengers to Caesar to inform him of what was happening. The sharp among you might be starting to see a developing pattern here. A situation arises that threatens either Rome's Gallic allies or Rome herself. Caesar quells the threat and mediates agreements between the tribes, seizes no lands, and does his best to maintain the status quo, only for another faction to make their bid for power. I could make an entire video going into depth on the Belgae coalition and providing a timeline and tribe-by-tribe evaluation of the actions and consequences of 57 BC, but for now, we'll have to do with a brief summary. Caesar met his legions, and together they marched north, where they were befriended by a Belgae tribe known as the Remi, who would become one of, if not the most devoted Roman ally for the next decade. The Remi, who refused to join the other Belgae in their insanity, were under attack by their kinsmen, and Caesar helped by fortifying the towns of his new allies and preventing their sack. Caesar then continued on to defeat the coalition, coming to terms with all tribes save one, who betrayed a ceasefire and attacked the Romans during the night. A single legion was also sent to the northwest under the command of Publius Crassus, the son of the triumvir Marcus Crassus, to ensure there would be no surprises from the Armorican tribes, and it appears that this legion encountered no trouble on its journey. The biggest evidence that Caesar was not planning an outright conquest and annexation of Gaul from the beginning comes here. After the submission of the Belgae, Caesar writes that he began rejecting envoys from the more distant tribes due to him being in a hurry to reach Italy and then Illyricum, which was his third province that he had not had a chance to oversee during these 2 full years of campaigns in Gaul. Illyricum, due to Caesar having to reallocate men to Gaul, and also due to its proximity to several hostile barbarians, was rife with problems that needed his attention. Further, having sensed that Gaul was now at peace and wanting to solidify his other provinces, Caesar set out for Illyricum without any hesitation. and it was only at this point, when Caesar was away, that the Gauls once again chose to break the peace. The offenders this time were the same Armorican tribesmen that Publius Crassus had been ordered to winter with. Due to the lack of crops in this area, the Romans were forced to send envoys to other tribes in an attempt to secure a food supply. One of these envoys, sent to a tribe called the Veneti, were detained and taken prisoner. The Veneti hoped to use them as bargaining chips to get their own hostages back from the Romans. Their neighboring tribes quickly did the same, swore an oath of common consent, and with that, Gaul erupted into war once more, stealing Caesar away from Illyricum and forcing him to return. It's here where I think Caesar's mind began to shift from a primarily defensive, maintain the status quo style approach, to realizing that among tribal barbarians, when there is no common government or speaker, there can be no sustained peace or balance, as the tension between both the tribes and outsiders, and the tribes themselves, prevents any kind of meaningful agreement from being reached. Only at this point, and really beginning the following year when the Germans begin their second offensive, do we see Caesar's speech shift from one of honoring many of the Gauls as noble and brothers, to disdaining them as traitorous and unreliable. It is here we can say that Caesar's actions are more consistent with conquest. But to make any Darth Vader-style claims about his intentions any earlier than this is not only disingenuous, but it's historical revision of the worst kind, which cannot be tolerated idly. Thank you for joining me in today's video. If you would like to see more content regarding Julius Caesar, let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe.